Mutcherson. I'm the co-dean at Rutgers Law School in Camden, and this is The Power of Attorney. So the great thing about doing this podcast is that it gives me an opportunity to talk to folks who are graduates of this law school and who've been out in the world doing amazing things. And today, the person who I get to talk to is Ted Trief. Ted, can you remind me of what year you graduated?
1976.
1976. I wanted you to say that instead of me. So that's exciting. So you've been out of law school for quite some time, which means that you've had a lot of opportunities to do some great things in the world. So I'm really interested in talking to you
Thank
today.
you, but don't remind me of how old I am.
I'll avoid that from now on. One of the things that I like to do with people on this podcast is ask them about what I sort of call their origin story. You know, how is it that you ended up in law school in general? What was it that drew you to the law? And then we'll talk a little bit about your law school experience. So how did you end up becoming a lawyer?
I always wanted to be a lawyer. I went to Bronx Science, which was a science and mathematics school, but I could never see myself having a career in math or science. Mm-hmm. I wanted the more collegiality that you'd get in a law school education.
But why law? What was it that you felt like you could do with a law degree?
Well, you could do good things.
Yeah.
I'm a very strong believer in the rule of law. And I believe in a civil society, it may be the most important thing that we have. So I'd be able to learn a lot. It wouldn't be stale. Every case requires you to learn things. And then I feel that we're doing good things.
Excellent. And you come from a family where there weren't other lawyers, is that right?
There weren't other lawyers. My parents were divorced when I was 10. My father was a motion picture operator. And neither of my parents finished college. My mother started college.
And so what was that like? I mean, did you grow up with parents who felt like it was really important for you to be able to go to college and to finish college?
I was a good student and they liked it, but I think they were not as focused as helicopter parents might be today.
Right. Times have changed, definitely. So you grew up in New York, though.
I grew up in the Bronx.
In the Bronx, in New York. And Bronx Science is an impressive high school to have gone to as well.
Thank you.
And then where did you end up for college?
I went to SUNY New Paltz, stayed in New York. I had a battle with my parents about going away. They wanted me to go to Queens College. Mm-hmm. I had a Regents scholarship, so tuition was zero at New Paltz, but I had to pay for room and board, and that was a struggle with my parents. But
oh, wow.
I finally won out about that.
So what was that transition like then to go to college?
It was tough. I had just turned 17. I was between 16 and 17 in September.
You were quite young.
I had skipped, and it was hard, and particularly in those days in the late 60s, early 70s. There was a lot of turmoil on campuses.
Right.
Kent State was my freshman year, and my last
Wow.
semester freshman year.
Wow. That's really interesting. So how would you describe your college experience then?
A fog.
In a good way?
Well, in good ways and bad ways. I mean, it was a real learning experience. Yeah. You know, I was much more mature my last 2 years than I was in my first two. Mm-hmm. But, you know, growth is not linear.
Right. And the hope is that when you go away to college, that it is this opportunity for you to start at least to kind of feel like an adult to some degree.
And you're responsible for your own actions.
Right.
And you have to learn what that means.
Right. Absolutely. So you knew you wanted to be a lawyer. You went to SUNY New Paltz, graduated, did well there, and then targeted law school. And did you go to law school right after college?
I graduated a semester early and worked as a taxi cab driver for a few months, and then backpacked in Europe and then started school.
And was that your first big travel experience?
I never went away as a kid anywhere. That was my first big travel experience.
So when you say you never went away as a kid, never left New York or just never left the States?
Maybe I left New York and went to New Jersey.
Okay. The big trip. So again, right? I mean, you leave to go to college and then you go to Europe by yourself after you graduate. And that seems like that would have been a really sort of significant life experience as well.
It was great. It was a great experience. I mean, I loved meeting people who were different than me. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there was nothing better than that.
Yeah, that's great to be able to do that. So you knew you wanted to go to law school. You made some money. You went backpacking, came back to the States, ready to become a lawyer.
Ready to go to law school, yeah.
Ready to go to law school. And how did you end up at Rutgers? Why us?
Well, a couple of reasons. Rutgers Camden in particular, because I didn't want to be back in New York. Mm-hmm. I wanted to still be on my own. Camden was a little more traditional than Newark at the time. and I wanted a traditional law school education, and the economics was just incredible. And to someone who's supporting himself, that made a world of difference.
Yeah.
It was a gift to me, and I wish current students could have the same gift.
Yeah. I mean, even keeping our tuition at the rate that it is now, which as compared to a lot of other schools is very reasonable, it's still, law school's an expensive endeavor.
And it affects career choices too.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So you were then able to graduate with no debt.
I had a little bit of debt anyway, because there's living expenses.
Right.
And
Right.
I worked part-time during law school also.
Okay.
I did some free clinical stuff, and then I got paid for doing bail interviews at the Roundhouse in Philadelphia. The Roundhouse in Philadelphia is the police station, and before you see the judge, there's a sheet that has to be filled out that's handed up, and it's for bail purposes to decide whether you would return. So I would be interviewing the defendants, but that was a paid position.
Considering that you then ended up being an ADA for a period of time, it seems like it would have given you a glimpse into a particular system.
Well, I also had a clinic at the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, through the law school, so I was getting experience there.
Got it.
And I was also doing work for the court-appointed master in Pennsylvania, doing an investigation of the Philadelphia House of Corrections and other penal institutions in Philadelphia. So I was getting a lot of diverse experience in the criminal law.
Right. And that seems like it wasn't an accident that you were doing this criminal law related work.
No, I wanted to be a litigator.
Yeah.
I didn't know whether I wanted to be a civil litigator or a criminal litigator, but I wanted to be in the courtroom.
One of the things I think is really interesting is that we're in this kind of amazing period of criminal justice reform, and in particular for us here in Camden, Philadelphia's DA now, Larry Krasner, is part of that wave of reform prosecutors who have come into office. And I imagine it's probably, if you were to do that kind of work now, that you might have a very different experience of it.
Well, DNA has changed the world.
Yes.
So, but we didn't have DNA.
Right.
And so DNA is a game changer, I think.
Right. So you were working part-time while you were in law school, which is an experience that I think a number of our students have. But you weren't a part-time law student. You were a full-time law student, but then you were working. And then how was that transition to law school? You said you wanted to have a traditional law school experience. Do you feel like that's what you had here?
I did. I thought the education here was fabulous. To this day, I use some of the things I learned.
I love that.
So I was very impressed with the education I got here.
And what was it about it that you found? I mean, I think that a lot of people think about law school and they imagine these very intimidating classrooms, with professors just standing in the front trying to humiliate students.
Well, there's some of that. There's some of that, but in everything you do in life, there's good and bad. And so I had great professors. I had some professors I didn't think were great, but overall, the experience was a very good experience.
So you went through your years of law school, and then you graduated. So what was your first job out of law school?
I was with the Bronx DA's office.
Okay.
As an ADA.
And was that a job that you got before you even graduated, or was it a job that you got after?
I got it just at the end of my law school career.
Okay. So you're a newly minted attorney, and you go back to New York, which is still more of a kind of rough and tumble New York than what a lot of us are used to
and
now.
The Bronx in particular.
And exactly. And then you were in the Bronx as an ADA. Let's talk about that experience a little bit.
The Bronx was burning then. And I walked in, and there were no working bathrooms except for the DAs and the judges. So the building was falling apart. There was a hole in the wall where people threw garbage.
Wow.
And the new building was under construction and was completed about 6 months later.
Okay.
But I worked in a building that was, if you called it a slum, that would be a fair comment.
Wow.
And that's where justice was being dispensed then.
Wow. So I feel like that would make it really difficult to feel like you were doing work that was important and respected, if that's the physical space that you were in.
Yeah, I always respected the law, and I respected what I was doing.
Yeah.
So that I didn't feel that it was being respected.
Right, boy.
And I guess the law is going through its own phases now where it's not being respected properly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there are always waves, right? So you're in this building and you are given cases. You have sort of people's lives in your hands.
In those days, you could practice in the criminal courts, which are misdemeanor courts in New York, without being admitted. So before you as long as you didn't fail the bar,
Okay.
and you were still waiting for the results, you could actually practice.
Okay.
So I started practicing within a week or so after being trained.
Wow.
You started out doing arraignments. After the arrest, you go to see a judge. You might be spending a day in jail, and then the judge decides whether to release you or set bail at a certain amount of money.
Right. And when you're the person who's the ADA who is doing arraignments that day, you're just file after file.
It's file after file. It's like working in a factory.
Right.
And there's no time to think.
Right.
And you're affecting people's lives.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that I think is, I mean, it's true sort of across many different areas of law that you're going to impact people's lives, sometimes in really significant ways. But in criminal court in particular, I think there's something really powerful about recognizing that the decisions that you are making literally can create this fissure in someone's life. They're either going to go to jail or prison, or they're not going to go to jail or prison. And how that plays itself out can really determine a lot.
You're actually looking at two different lives.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at the lives of the victim, and you're looking at the lives of the defendant.
Mm-hmm.
You want to make sure you're not putting the wrong person in jail,
Mm-hmm.
but you might want to make sure that you're putting the right person in jail.
Right.
And you realize how much weight is on your shoulders, particularly then.
Right.
Now, the prosecutor's offices are much more organized in a way that there's double checks and triple checks.
Mm-hmm.
But the decisions that I was making as an ADA were decisions on my own.
Wow.
I could choose the bail amount. I could choose whether to ask to keep someone in jail or not.
Right.
And now I was 23 when I started.
Yeah, I was going to say, you must have been very young.
So that's a lot to ask.
And particularly of somebody who, you know, at 23, you don't necessarily have a huge amount of life experience. And you're given these little short periods of time to look at these files and say, okay, this is a person who we should set bail really high, or this is a person who we should set bail really low. And then you have to sit with those decisions.
Yes, and you have to care.
Right. So you were doing arraignments, and then how long were you in the DA's office?
3.5 to 4 years.
So it can't be the case that you did arraignments the whole time.
No.
Of
Only
course.
for a very short period of time.
Yeah.
And then I went to grand jury.
Okay.
And then I went to a trial bureau where I tried rapes and robberies.
Wow.
And then I went to a specialized bureau where I tried children who committed serious felonies.
Oh boy.
So they were being tried as adults. So
Wow.
there were 2 of us in that bureau at the end when I left the office.
Okay. One of the things that I often find really interesting in talking to people is, you know, lots of folks have those cases that just sort of, you know, sear into your brain. And I wonder if they're particularly when you're working with children who are accused of crimes and are being tried as adults. I imagine that there must have been some moments there that were pretty difficult.
One that's sort of seared in my brain is I had a homicide call for a year. So you'd go down to the police precincts where the defendant would be held. And if there was a confession, you would take a videotape confession and give the Miranda warnings to the defendant. And one late evening, I was called down to one of the precincts in the South Bronx, and there was a child, 15 years old, who was a prostitute, who was being charged with murder. She had set her John up to be robbed and killed. Killed in multiple ways. You know, it was a brutal homicide, and she confessed to it in great detail. Her mother was present in the video room, and at the end of this, which I always did, I would ask the defendant whether they had any questions, and she said she did. And I said, "What is it?" And she said, "Can I go home now?" And I came back home and I said, "This is so sad," because she had absolutely no idea what she had done.
So how do you carry that around?
Well, that's part of the reason I left. It got upsetting to me. I didn't want to spend my whole life in that environment.
And it's challenging. I mean, you know, again, you know, we're in this time of criminal justice reform and sort of trying to think about, you know, how do we have a system that, as you say, is a system that's fair to people who are victims or survivors of crimes, but also a system that is not, putting people in prison who shouldn't be there. And that's also sort of thinking about, if we're not going to keep somebody in prison for the rest of their life, how do we put people in a position where they can come back into the world? And that's, I didn't do criminal law either because I think that's so difficult.
The flip side of this is, so I've experienced both sides of the coin, where people really ought to go to jail and people shouldn't go to jail. And the society has to make those calls, and they better make it right because they're affecting real people.
Absolutely. So you had this 3.5, 4 years when you were an ADA, and I want to sort of talk about where you went from there. But one of the things that I'm also really curious about is, were there things that you learned about either the law or yourself that moved you in a particular direction once you knew you didn't want to be an ADA anymore?
I experimented. So I wasn't sure. I knew I didn't want to be a criminal defense lawyer. I wanted out of that system. I thought I got the experience I wanted, and I wanted to move on. So I took a job doing defense work. I represented Chrysler and Honda in products liability cases.
Got it.
I was there for 2 years. It was okay. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't what I wanted. And then I left and worked with a gentleman who was about 20 years older than I was. We had a successful firm, and I decided I wanted to go out with myself with one of my partners there at that firm. And I formed my current firm in 1987, which has gone through its many changes also. But
right. One of the things that I often talk about with students is this idea that, when you graduate from law school, the job that you have when you graduate from law school is not necessarily the job you're going to have 5 years out. It's not necessarily the job that you're going to have 10 years out, right? I mean, one of the things that can be really nice about a law degree is that it gives you this opportunity to kind of skip around to different things and figure out what's gonna settle best for you.
Right, and sometimes things find you.
Right. So you were doing products liability, and then you shifted gears a little bit, and then ultimately you opened your own firm, which I always think is just the boldest thing in the world.
It was scary. I had 2 young kids and a house, so it's not so easy.
Yeah. So you were just building from scratch, or did you have some folks who came with you from where you, like some clients who came with you?
Well, I wasn't sure what clients came with me. I didn't tell anybody before I was leaving because I thought that there was an ethical issue about telling anybody I was leaving. Once I left and opened my firm, I told people I was working with where I was.
Right.
And everybody went with me.
Oh, look at that.
Which I had no idea that would happen.
Right.
But, you still need time to build up money to take money out yourself.
Right. So how did you build a client base? Well, first tell me, what kind of work were you doing? Were you just sort of, we'll do what comes in the door at first?
No, I was doing some products liability work, which I had a reputation from the other job. But I was doing it this time now on the plaintiff's side.
Right.
So there were lawyers who would get products liability cases and didn't know what to do with them, and knew that I had experience with Chrysler and Honda.
Okay.
So I got some of that. Some of the clients who I'd work with. So while I was at that other firm, I was representing Harvey Comics, Casper the Friendly Ghost. And Marvel Comics was buying the business. They were on the opposite side of me. They didn't buy the business, but the person who was in charge of sending legal work out liked my work, started sending me work.
There you go.
Then I lost all that business when Ron Perlman bought the business. So those are the vagaries of life.
Right. So you were doing products liability work in your own firm.
And commercial litigation.
Tell folks what kinds of things fall under commercial litigation.
Well, we did a bunch of licensing litigation for Marvel, but we had other licensing and contract claims for them.
Okay.
We had a very varied commercial practice also.
Okay. And, I say this as a torts professor, so I'm obviously very biased. That products liability work can be incredibly detailed and incredibly difficult. When it's something that's really obvious, then fine, maybe they just write you a check. But sometimes those can be incredibly complicated cases.
Oh, yeah, sure. And we practice both in New York and New Jersey. So we were familiar with New Jersey rules and New York rules. And we had an opportunity once to bring a case in either state. But New Jersey's rules on products liability in the workplace was much more favorable than New York rules of products liability in the workplace. So if you remove a guard as an employer in New Jersey, you can subject yourself to being sued by your employee. In New York, that doesn't apply. So we brought one of these, a very serious case in New Jersey.
Right.
And sued the employer and received a 7-figure resolution.
So you're doing these products liability cases. And one of the other things that I think that we don't always think about when we're in law school and we're getting ready to start practicing is, sure, you have to know the law, but as you're doing these particular cases that have very, specific, think about people who are doing patent law or big pharma kinds of issues, that all of a sudden you have to understand stuff that you didn't imagine you would have to understand.
Isn't that great?
Yeah. It can be, certainly.
It's great.
Yeah.
It keeps you fresh, right?
Absolutely. Right. So do you sort of feel like with each new case, it's kind of like, all right, now I have to learn, how these are made and how somebody else makes them and what makes them safer or less safe?
Yes, and it's fun.
Yeah.
That's one of the nice things about being a litigator. You don't get stale. You have to learn something new each time you have a case.
Right.
You either have to learn something new about the law or something new about business.
Right. There's so much conversation now about how many cases settle, so that there's this vision, I think, that some people have that litigation is not as important as it used to be, that it's maybe not, the thing that you should target. But it seems to me that there's something about, one, litigation that's never going to go away, but also that it's a very particular type of career. So as you say, one thing is that you're constantly learning, that you're constantly sort of on your toes, but also that being in a courtroom is really different from other ways to practice law.
But litigation is just not just the courtroom.
Sure.
I mean, depositions are a large part of litigation. So you're still using your cross-examination skills and your questioning skills, but you're not in a courtroom.
Right.
And some of that's very, very much enjoyable.
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
Yeah. And I don't know what courses were sort of on the roster when you were a student here, but we have, a course on deposition advocacy that's specifically about how do you lawyer in that particular setting and how is it different potentially from being in a courtroom.
And it's exciting because you're thinking on your feet.
Right. One of the things that I have often heard people say as they're, students or others, as they're trying to kind of figure out what they want to do with their law degree is, oh, I could never be a litigator because, I'm really quiet, or, I could never be a litigator because I'm not super comfortable talking in front of a bunch of people, or, I could never be a litigator because I'm not aggressive enough to do that kind of work. And my sense is that lots of different people can be litigators, and that there are lots of different ways to be somebody who's successful in a courtroom.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. I think you can't be sensitive, and you can't be afraid to lose. Mm-hmm. But you can have a lot of different paths to get to being a good litigator.
Right. Right.
Because everybody who litigates is going to lose sometime.
Sure.
And anybody who hasn't lost a case hasn't tried a case. Mm-hmm. And so, but you can't take it personally. You can't go home and shrivel up.
Yeah.
You have to go on to your next case. So I think you need that quality.
But then if you don't have those other things that people, claim that you need to have, what do you think makes somebody good in a courtroom?
I think you need certain skills. Mm-hmm. You need to know where things are taking you. You need to be visionary. You have a vision of where you're going. If you don't have those skills, it's going to be hard. But you can be soft-spoken. Mm-hmm. You can be theatrical. You can, be tough. You can get to that same way with a lot of different personalities.
Right.
But you have to be thorough. You have to think logically. You have to know where you're going. Mm-hmm. And you have to listen to what someone is saying.
Right.
I mean, those kinds of qualities are important.
Right. Right. So let's talk about being a person who has his own law firm, which we sort of talked about already as being difficult in a variety of different ways. But one of the things, and I think that this is true, again, of other professions, if you're, a physician who opens your own medical practice or, these other folks, that you are trained in a particular discipline, but once you open your own office, you're a business person.
Yes, in part. There are things that I think I can do because I have the skills to do them. Uh-huh. There are things I think I can't do because I don't have the skills to do them.
Okay.
And you need to separate those
Right.
two things out. I don't think you should be doing things that you really have no clue on what you're doing
Right.
to develop a business. I do products liability work. Mm-hmm. I might be able to transfer that to construction litigation. I probably can't translate that to patent litigation.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So there are certain areas where you can really move your experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let me go back to the business question again, though, because I think part of what I'm asking is that the skill set of being a lawyer is not necessarily the same skill set of being somebody who runs a business, right? And who's sort of thinking about things like, oh, I have to make payroll and I have to do this thing, and so how do you figure out how to be somebody who's running a business?
I, from early on, would try to take a pen to paper and try to analyze what I could reasonably expect to bring in.
Okay.
And what my expenses were.
Okay.
And then think about terms of how that was going to be met. You know, the first year it was met by a secondary mortgage on my house.
Yeah. That's a big risk. You have to believe really deeply in yourself.
Yes, that's true. But you also need to be realistic and look carefully as to what you think the income for the year is going to be, or the next year. I thought there'd be less expenses, startup expenses in year 2 than it would be in year 1. And if I could keep the business coming in, it would pay for itself.
Right. So you've had some big cases.
We have.
Some big cases related to the work that you've been doing. And I'd love to hear about a few of those too.
Some of the more exciting things recently that I've done is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the debit overdraft cases.
Mm-hmm.
So the debit cards were issued to be something that was the equivalent of cash, so that you would use the money, you would spend the money, and it would come out of your account immediately. Right. And it was a good way for people not to overspend.
Right.
A lot of people who are using debit cards happen to be people who were elderly, minorities, students, people who you might be able to take advantage of. And the banks looked at this and said, these overdraft fees are gigantic money makers. So the expectation is, as you use a debit card, you would have the money automatically depleted from the account. And so I'll give you a very simple example. So if there was $50 in your account and you went to Starbucks and charged $5, you'd have $45 left.
Right.
And then if you went to CVS and charged $10, there'd be $35 left, and et cetera. And then let's say the last charge was $60. That would overdraft your account.
Right.
But if you reordered them at the end of the day and had the largest charge done first, you can then have 4 or 5 overdrafts. To some people, that would put them into bankruptcy. To other people, they would just pay it. And they had a formula as to who they would deny the overdrafts to and who they would let overdraft their accounts and then reorder them. So we sued most of the major banks, a team of lawyers, like 30 law firms. I was on the executive committee, and I led the litigation against Citizens Bank.
Okay.
And most of those cases settled. The one against Citizens Bank settled for $137 million. So that was a very successful settlement. However, very interestingly and very apropos to today, 2 of the banks didn't settle, Wachovia and Wells Fargo. And the law changed in the middle of the litigation by allowing corporations to compel consumers to waive their rights to class actions and at the same time arbitrate their claims. And so those who didn't settle received the benefit of these new laws, and they paid nothing. That case went up to the 11th Circuit, which affirmed the decisions to compel arbitration and waive class actions, and the Supreme Court denied cert. So that's apropos for today.
Yeah. So on one hand, if you're somebody who uses any kind of service or any kind of consumer product, probably at least a couple of times a year, you get some notice that you are part of a class. And on one hand, I think people feel like, oh, well, there are too many class actions and it's just a money grab and it's not, very useful. On the other hand, though, class actions are a really important way of making sure often that whole industries are acting in the best interests of people and consumers. And so we have we're in this sort of challenging space, I think, where there's this sort of derisive way of talking about class actions, but also maybe a lack of understanding about why class actions are important.
It's a little bit like tobacco. It's a misinformation campaign that's going on. For years we heard that tobacco really wasn't bad for your health.
Right.
Now I think we can recognize that it is. When you have class action waivers and arbitration clauses, there are no remedies.
Right.
So the consumer has absolutely no remedy. And so you'll hear people who are against class actions talk about, give you examples of things. And there's some examples that we can argue about, like whether or not coupons should be a settlement or not. And I understand when someone says coupons should not be a settlement.
Right.
We don't settle cases for coupons.
Yeah.
But cash settlements are real remedies and really discourage bad behavior.
Yes.
And you have some chance of being compensated. We handled a case against the Darden Restaurant Group, and it was a wage and hour class where it's called an opt-in class. So instead of automatically being a member, you have to request to be a member. So the average server got some thousands of dollars in our settlement. That's real money for someone who waits on tables.
Absolutely.
And that was a class case.
Right.
Interestingly enough, we brought it as a class case, and the judge dismissed it as a class case and compelled everybody to go to arbitration. But since we had so many class members who had already joined, we were able to bring them together in the arbitration phase.
Okay.
And ultimately settled almost every one of these cases.
Right. So there's the class action issue, right? Whether you can get a court to certify a class, and whether there are statutes that get passed to make it impossible to do that. But the other piece of it that you've talked about is the arbitration piece of it.
They
right?
go hand
Not
in glove.
letting people go into court.
They used hand in glove.
Yeah.
The case law refers to an arbitration act that took place in the 1930s. That was an arbitration act that was designed for business-to-business relationships, not to consumer relationships. Okay. And they've jumped on that, and by judicial decision have permitted the compelling of arbitration.
Right.
If you put it in your contract. Right.
Right.
Even if the contract is not really signed, but is just on a screen when you charge your product.
Right, which is so much of what we do now, just hitting a checkbox.
In the overdraft cases, they discussed the fact that the overdraft clauses, the provisions, were in the depositor agreement, which was 30 pages. So I asked the head of overdraft services whether he was a depositor at Citizens Bank. And he said yes. And I said, did you read your depositor's agreement? No. Nope. Because they wouldn't let you read it, right?
Right.
Can you imagine reading a 20 or 30-page depositor agreement when you're opening up a bank account?
Right.
You'd be sitting at the desk. They'd throw you out of the bank.
Right. And you'd also have to understand all these different
pieces. And you'd ask questions. And
right.
The bank would go out of business.
Right.
It's not designed to be read by a consumer.
Right. Absolutely. And I would like to think in these kinds of cases, whether it's the overdraft case or whether it's the wage case, that those are things that change practices within an industry. At least they should.
Well, we took the deposition of one of the officers of Darden, and because of our litigation, they actually changed the rules in the middle of our litigation. So I know it had effect because I saw it, and he said it did.
Right. Yeah, and I guess
their argument was it was an aberration that they were cleaning up.
Right. that you were kind enough to point out to them.
We were kind enough to point out.
So that they could fix it. So what do you, in this world where we see these kinds of things going on, whether it's these arbitration clauses or these, refusals to certify classes, or, the fact that we live in this world where we are, constantly agreeing to terms that we haven't read, and I'm just as guilty of that as anybody.
Me too.
So what does that portend for us for the future?
The House of Representatives has passed legislation that addresses that. It hasn't passed the Senate and hasn't gone to and the Senate's not considering it. But it's conceivable that within our lifetime, there's going to be statutes at the federal level, because I think a lot of our legislators are aware of the problem.
Right. So let me ask you one more question, if you don't mind. Every sort of choice that we make at various points has an impact on where we end up in life. And I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about how, when you look at the sort of span of your life, how the decision to be a lawyer has set you on a particular path.
It's been a great career choice for me. I would not do anything else. I'm 67 years old now, and I'm still practicing law, and I still enjoy it. So I don't know how to answer the question other than it's been very good to me, as Rutgers has been very good to me in the past. I am happy I chose it.
Well, thank you so much, Ted. It was really wonderful talking to you today.
Nice seeing you again.
Me too. The Power of Attorney is produced by Rutgers Law School. With 2 locations, minutes from Philadelphia and New York City, Rutgers Law offers the prestige and reputation of a large, nationally known university with a personal small campus experience.
Learn more by visiting law.rutgers.edu.